so we are getting close to the end of this wonderful workshop that Mary Fenway has organized, but we couldn't end without a plenary, and I think it's wonderful to have such a distinguished plenary for this to conclude this workshop. And Professor Rita Copeland is Shell and Burton Rosenberg Professor of the Humanities, Professor of Classical Studies, English, and Comparative Literature. So many titles and fields that she covers, and indeed I think she works across a large number of fields and periods, including medieval literature in English, Latin, and French, literary theory from ancient to modern, the history of rhetoric, the reception of classical traditions in medieval and early modern Europe, intellectuals, learning and literacy in medieval Europe, and the history of emotions, which is one of the reasons why we have invited her to come here. Her teaching combines many of those aspects in antiquity and the Middle Ages. She looks also at how the Middle Ages are considering and understanding antiquity. She has several projects going on. One of them is the Oxford History of Classical Reception in English Literature from 800 to 1558, and essays on medieval Latin annotation and glossing, and on Aristotle's rhetoric in medieval England. She's also interested in the representation of the intellectual in pre-modern Europe, from the late rhetorical culture to late medieval university cultures and heretical communities. She's currently working on a book on rhetoric and emotion, and which brings me to her many publications, one of which I remember very fondly reading and learning from when I was a doctoral student. So a book published in 1991, very, very important book with regard to translation studies and rhetoric. That is the book called Rhetoric, Hermeneutics and Translation in the Middle Ages, Academic Traditions and Vernacular Texts, a very significant contribution. Another book that is of great interest is the Criticism and Dissent in the Middle Ages, published by CUP in 1996, which was followed by another book with Cambridge, Pedagogy, Intellectuals and Dissent in the later Middle Ages, Lodody and Ideas of Learning. She has also co-authored in 2009 with OUP an anthology called Medieval Grammar and Rhetoric, Language, Arts and Literary Theory from 380 to 1475. Has co-edited with Peter Struck, the Cambridge Companion to Allegory, in 2010 with CUP, and in 2009 also co-edited with Christopher Cannon and Nicholas Zeman, Medieval Grammar and the Literary Arts, in a special issue of New Medieval Literatures. An incredibly prolific scholar, an incredibly generous scholar as well. I think we benefited from her comments during those 2 days, which have been very, very insightful and very useful. And I think that her lecture is going to do a bit of a kind of response to the papers and presentations that have been given, but I'm sure her personal reflections on rhetoric and emotion are going to be offered along those lines. And we really look forward to your response, which is called Disciplines, Form and Writing, the History of Emotion. Thank you very much, Rita, for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. This is a tremendous honor. Let me thank Mary for putting together this amazing conference. I think all the credit really does go to you. We'll have an occasion to applaud. There'll be more applause for you later, but this was good. We'll get some in now. So thank you very much. I wrote part of these remarks way in advance, largely in response to the readings that were sent out, that is to the secondary readings, or partly in response to secondary readings. And then I wrote up some of the responses when I had some abstracts, but where I did not have abstracts, you may have seen me sitting and taking very careful notes. So what I mean to say is that things may get a little bit ragged towards the end as I shift between printed out pages and the various inserts that I've planned, but we'll see. So thank you very much for this opportunity to offer some ideas about the study of emotion in the Middle Ages and to participate in a very valuable workshop. When Mary approached me about this event and the way that I might participate, we agreed that my role would be to offer a general and sympathetically directive, emphasis on sympathetic, sympathetically directive response to the emergent themes of the workshop, and at the same time to give a progress report on the findings of my own research on emotions and rhetoric. In this way, I could make some comparisons among different kinds of approaches to structuring a history of the emotions. And as you know, I've also left room in my remarks to comment on the specific issues that have been raised in the papers. I am fascinated with the disciplinary dimensions of emotions research, something that was reflected in much of the supplementary reading that was provided for us. So I would like to begin with some meta-disciplinary considerations, comparing different disciplinary framings of emotions and their history, that is, the history of emotions. Among the supplementary materials that we read, Barbara Rosenwein's work is the most wide-ranging because she addresses historiographical, neuroscientific, and sociological approaches. But she also speaks as a historian to historians, asking how science and social science can matter for historiography. I would like to open up the framework to the arts and literature, since that is where the weight of our interest here falls. Emotion studies has proved to be a field of inquiry that has brought or necessitated more multidisciplinary interaction than almost any other field, because emotion studies has also drawn so much from the medical and neurobiological sciences, as well as from history and sociology and psychology, and it keeps going on, psychoanalysis, philosophy, political theory, all of which we have heard in the course of these 2 days. But what happens when we disentangle the approaches and look at the study from the perspective of particular disciplinary formations? That is, how has one in a particular discipline been taught to think? And thus, what does one expect to find? So I begin with some questions which are not going to be all that amazing to you, but I lay them out there. Are historical emotions there to be talked about, or are the sources that talk about emotions there to be talked about? I know I am preaching to the choir here, but nevertheless, I'm going to go through this exercise. So obviously, what lies behind this question is the issue of representation. How do we know the past? Especially a past that is as fugitive and surprisingly incomplete to us as the Middle Ages, except through the lens of representation. Another related distinction that we can draw is history of emotions or emotions in the history of. So let me begin with some disciplinary specifics. Does a historian, since we read a lot of Rosenwein, does a historian, a medieval historian, approach medieval emotions differently from the way in which a textual scholar or an art historian or a music historian approaches medieval emotions? And I'm going to risk some generalizations that many historians would find unpalatable. I don't know if there are any historians in the room, so I don't know, put your hands over your ears or something, but I think they merit discussion in this context. Right. The historian, social historian, political historian, uses texts as evidence of practice or as evidence of scripts, which presumably then lead to practice. But the textuality in which the practice or script is described remains transparent. And I don't mean by this that historians don't critique their textual sources as partial or as interested, or that they don't recognize context. But the textual source remains a means of accessing evidence about something beyond the text. It's not the object of study. So, the historian might seek, and I'm quoting, methodological tools to help historians more rigorously assess and work with the emotions in the texts of the past. This is, to understand the text better, the terminology used, in order to look for the emotions that are in the text. The text is there to be decoded so that it can yield up its evidence, not about itself, as a text, but about the reality of which it is a transcript. The text is a discursive construct only as long as it remains undecoded. When we can get at what it refers to, we can know something about emotions in history beyond the systematic distortions of language and the interference of discursive systems such as theology, philosophy, poetry. Rosenwein critiques various approaches as not recognizing polyvalence of emotion. I myself wonder who would not recognize that emotions are polyvalently meaningful. But ultimately, the question that I have to ask is how do we subscribe, if we do, to a notion of tracking historical systems of feeling? Again, I'm using the term that she uses. Are these systems outside of language? Now, for me, as someone trained in literature, I am still sufficiently post-structuralist to question this. So I put my cards on the table. That is, from a post-structuralist perspective, things are there, like biology's there, but none of us access these things except through language or through discourse. So there may be neurological grounds for emotion, but how much does that help us historically? I myself am more interested in discourses of emotion. That is, we represent ourselves to ourselves through discourse. In one way or another, on the other hand, the historian pursues the historian's dream of finding what was really there experientially, whether in terms of social history or institutional history. Thus, the fine-tuned examining of emotion words will lead us to some apprehension of the thing itself, what they experienced, including what they thought they experienced. So I want to compare these are big and possibly flabby generalizations, but I want to compare the historiographical discipline with the disciplines of literature and the arts, where the object of our inquiry is itself the evidence that we seek. And so I'm going to start with the literary scholar. Most of the papers here were in literature, but I will get to art history and music history. So for the literary scholar, obviously the focus is on textual questions. The text as literary representation, the specifics of genre, language, form. Those are the two issues that really emerged from this conference with big stars around them. Audience as well. The history of a given textuality, such as drum or devotional textuality. And then a question mark. Is the textual a theory of representation, or is a given textuality a theory of representation? That, to me, is very interesting for us to think about, to debate. To what extent have the range of materials that we've covered yielded up discontinuous, but nevertheless theoretical reflections on themselves? So that's that. And now what about the art historian? And now I speak not as an art historian, so I stand under correction if I'm wrong, but I tried at least to think through as much as I could. So the art historian might be thinking about the representation of emotion within generic and cultural parameters, gesture as rhetorically meaningful within an iconographic script, the image as both affirmative and persuasive. I feel that this has been something that has been on our agenda. The compact between producer and audience, and I just felt that came so clear to me today with the Pope, who really wanted that cope. And then one has to add also the physical medium, ivory, cloth, parchment. And actually what came to what emerged for me much surprisingly perhaps in this conference was how parchment is, by comparison to ivory and cloth, relatively invisible. That is, it is itself a kind of medium of transmission. Of course, obviously, people know that it comes from an animal, but its materiality is, perhaps I'm wrong about that. You two can correct, not to us, not invisible to us, but anyway, that there's something about the very tactile presentness of the ivory, or of that extraordinarily woven cloth, embroidered cloth. Anyway, so that's the art historian. I think you can see where I'm going with this. And then the music historian, you can tell me if I'm wrong. Long before I met you, I already had the question mark after representation of emotion in music. I've been around music historians enough to know that this is a fraught issue. Music as form, music as embodied, music as voiced. The rhetoric of music, the rhetoric of its sonal effects, and I added soundscape this morning because it's just the perfect term. And of course, once again, with a question mark, music as a music as a communal script, and perhaps music as a theory of emotion. By communal script, I was thinking not in loose terms. I was thinking very specifically of singing in a choir. In other words, something that brings people together around a specific task, not the kind of loose notion of communal script. So, other disciplines that have been closely allied with the arts and literature have also developed their benchmark approaches to the emotions. And some of these things just deserve to be, mentioned. Obviously, gender theory, the gender theorist, the gender historian. So emotion comes into being in relation, or has come into being in relation to ideology critique. Affect theory, one hears a lot about affect theory. The turn to affect, or what is considered a precognitive feeling, and that's a notion borrowed from neuroscience, in materialist recuperations of the body as a political entity. So in other words, a way of talking about how people behave before they have emotions. Affect theory in humanist studies has emerged largely out of modern or contemporary concerns. And here I'm thinking especially of Eve Sedgwick's search for what she calls the techniques of non-dualist thought, that is, getting away from body versus mind in contemporary intellectual culture. So in other words, what I'm suggesting there is that affect theory is great, but its origins are very much in contemporary concerns, and we have to do a lot. If we're going to do it, we got to do a lot of work to take it all the way back to the pre-modern, if that is what we're going to do. The historian of religion. I don't think we do have people in here who are historians of religion, or who wear two hats as literary historians and historians of religion. But the historian of religion might think about the history of practice, ritual or prayer, the history of theology, intersections with history of philosophy, but also with histories of the arts, so literature, music, visual arts, etc. And finally, I think this is the last of mine. One of the disciplines that contributes significantly to history of the emotions and emotion studies is philosophy. And we also need to understand how it breaks down and what assumptions govern it. So the philosopher versus the historian of philosophy. They're not having a fight, but it's just to kind of put them on two different sides. So the philosopher often comes with an interest in the best explanation of emotion in an ahistorical way. For example, a philosopher like Heidegger, who is interested in the best explanation of emotion so as to underwrite the best explanation of phenomenological being. So in other words, he's not interested in a particular historical moment, he is interested he's working outside of history. The philosopher who is also interested in the field of ethics might often consider the Aristotelian tradition of ethics and the pathe, that is the emotions, but again in a general non-historical way. The historian of philosophy will or may have an interest in systems of thought and their transformation. So, for example, the Finnish philosopher Simo Nuttila, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Does anyone know how to pronounce this name? I'm gonna. It could be Knutala. I'm not sure. Anyway, an amazing book that he wrote called Emotions in Ancient and Medieval Philosophy. Fantastic book. Some philosophers are also interested in restoring therapeutic approaches of the past. So, for example, Martha Nussbaum's Upheavals of Thought, or Richard Sorabji's Emotion and Peace of Mind, which both promote Stoic thought for us now in modern times. In other words, bring back, first of all, let's rehabilitate the Stoics. They're not as bad as we all think they were, and let's bring them back. Let us see how we can make our own lives better by returning to Stoic sensibilities, especially in the case of Sorabji's book. These are what one would call normative approaches within moral philosophy, telling you what you should do. There may also be, for the historian of philosophy, a history of systems of thought that provide a theoretical base for interpreting representations or conditions of representation. And so here, I don't have this up there, but my examples might be classicists like David Constant or Robert Castor. Neither of them are historians of philosophy, but they have the interdisciplinary reach of many classicists to work with philosophy and bring those materials to bear on the contemporary classical texts in literature or historiography. One question that interests me, it's a slight side question, but it's an interesting one. To what extent do philosophers and historians of philosophy recognize that by studying a theoretical system, they're also studying a system of representation? For example, Nussbaum and Sorabji are virtually evangelical about the moral and emotional truth of the Stoics. So they stop seeing Stoicism as a discourse of representation, and they simply start seeing it as a set of truth claims. I'm not going to try to discuss all the other possibilities, the complexities of medical and biological sciences and neuroscience, because I don't know their assumptions very well. I'm not going to try to discuss that figurational sociology of Elias that Nussbaum talks about, because its implications for medieval studies are pretty limited. What does trouble me, though, about the application of such methods, such as neuroscience and this progressivist model of civilization, what troubles me about that, applying that to our period, is that they make universalizing claims. They may work in a temporal dimension. They may accept, for example, that biology changes over time, or that human social organizations change over time, but they don't work in history. And what we do, I think we could all agree, is we work in history, and we think historically. So I want to return to the question of how we as medievalists in the fields associated with literature and arts can position our work in relation to that vast terrain of emotions history. I myself, for myself, have become suspicious of wholesale histories of emotions that are detached from other historical discursive systems, because, to my mind, it risks entering a kind of loop where you can't really, there isn't a right answer, or you end up in a kind of continuous debate about what's an emotion, or what is an emotion a practice, is it an impulse, is it a habitus? What I would argue for is a wholesale approach to what people are reading or what systems of understanding about the emotions they have at any given time that leads them to define emotions, use emotions, understand them, and represent them in particular ways. Thus, the discourses about emotion in ancient and medieval philosophy, or medieval attempts to anatomize the soul, might be very useful to us, not because people in practice observed these ideas, but because they constitute powerful diachronic records of intellectual representation. This is my last slide, I think. So, for example, here's a couple of medieval theoretical frames of reference. The monastic discipline of ascesis, which seeks to extirpate bad emotion, and that has roots in Stoic thought. It's really good for us to know about that. or medieval philosophical psychologies. We have these taxonomies of emotion, especially in the 13th century. So one of my favorites is the Franciscan Jean de la Rochelle, who's drawing on Avicenna's work and organizes the emotions in terms of their relationship to the different emotional appetites of the soul. Okay, so for example, you can have these theoretical frameworks, but you could say, for example, a medieval preacher will know something about these two frameworks. He might know about the monastic discipline of ascesis, or he might know about, indeed, the seven deadly sins. He sure knows about that. Or he might know even about Jean de la Rochelle and his taxonomy of the emotions. But, and this is where it gets interesting to me, to judge from the sermons that this preacher preaches, none of these philosophical, theological systems stops him from targeting the emotional vulnerabilities of his audience when he urges compunction or empathy or pity or fear or indignation or indeed anger or a combination of these. So in other words, there are interesting disjunctions between the available systems of thought and the practices of poetics and rhetoric. And this is where I think the histories of literature, art, and music can offer fruitful direction, as they have for me over these past 2 days. I believe that we, in these disciplines, are best positioned to interrogate the extra-textual reality fixation of historians by insisting on the opacity of texts, and I include images and other media, by insisting on that is the texts or media's continual resistance to transparent legibility and referentiality, by insisting on their imbrication with and yet independence from other theoretical discourses like philosophy or theology. In other words, the very dissenting practices of poetics. And by poetics now I'm speaking really broadly, the constructed arts. I think it can be productive to engage the ideas of particular philosophers who've made important contributions to theories of emotion, but we also have to be conscious of the ahistorical bent of pure philosophy. So, my own project on the history of rhetoric and the emotions, this is now my progress report. My own project on the history of rhetoric and the emotions grows out of my work on rhetoric over many years. My interest in medieval ideas of the emotions sprang out of and it really sprung on me. It took me completely by surprise. But it sprang out of my ongoing concern with the medieval reception of Aristotle's Rhetoric, a text that offered medieval readers a completely new way of treating the emotions. This is in Book 2 of the Rhetoric, which is all about the emotions. And that I think it galvanized connections among existing frames of reference. The history of rhetoric through the long Middle Ages has offered me a way of charting not the emotions, capital E, but representations of the emotions in a theoretical discourse that was charged with engaging emotions, that is, rhetoric. It was the job of rhetoric not just to persuade, but to shape responses through reason and to produce an aesthetic that was affective in its formal composition. In other words, the form made you do something. It produced an impact. Within rhetorical theory, at different points in the history of rhetoric, reason and emotion are seen to work in harmony with each other, and at other times, they are almost violently at odds. So I want to ask what roles emotion plays in a system largely dedicated to understanding and representing emotions. How and when was analysis of emotion a core component of rhetorical theory? How did emotional suasion hijack the theory of rhetoric at certain critical points? Was rhetoric suspect because emotional persuasion was suspect? I think that does happen in a lot of cases. And then again, how does emotion illuminate the history of rhetoric? A lot of systems of ideas in the Middle Ages enable us to chart the historical changes in the history, in historical changes in emotions, emergent ideas about politics and the state, or changing notions of consciousness. And for this, you would think about the very complex history of confession, the point at which there is a notion of the self to become a locus for study of emotional self-knowledge. Rhetoric, too, is subject to historical circumstances. For example, medieval systems of emotional thought can be tied in with the virtues. Style or eloquence can be perceived as an emotional stimulus. Or, with the reception of Aristotle's rhetoric in the 13th century, we begin to see a new systematic understanding of the emotions as a form of political knowledge. So, rhetoric is a theoretical system of emotional understanding that changes radically from late antiquity to the later Middle Ages. I see my approach as having something in common with intellectual history, but I think it is finally closer to the literary and artistic approaches I described earlier, because I'm trying to write the history of a textual theory of representation. So the object of my analysis isn't some experience beyond the theory. My object is the theory, its changing aspect as it progresses through history. Now, literature is, of course, a key resource for the study of the emotions because of all the qualities that we associate with literariness, exemplarity, experience, and so forth. It's important for my study as well. How does one choose and organize the instantiations of a theoretical system? Does a theoretical system always translate cleanly into literary production? This is one of the biggest problems for me, looking at the relationship between the theory that's out there and then the literary texts that are supposed to instantiate it. It's important for me to look for the formal reinterpretation of strategies and precept, rather than for something loosely defined as affect or emotion. And so what I'm really coming down to is an interest in form, and that is one of the key things that I've got out of this conference. So one of the ways in which I've been helped by the presentations in this workshop is to see how other scholars grapple with the formal properties of representation in their materials. In fact, one emergent theme of this workshop has been the insistence on form, and a perfect case in point is the famous prose rhythms of the talking of the love of God. You're going to see, where are you, you talking people, you talking of the love of, you're going to see, I wrote this bit before I heard your guided reading, so this was just me rethinking my ancient relationship with the talking, wooing texts. But nevertheless, those famous prose rhythms of the talking of the love of God, the distinctive internal rhymes and syntax, the sensory effects of the prose that command an affective engagement from the devotee who is voicing, or, as you suggested, consuming the words, or, as you suggested, a sensuality that's an alternative to worldly pleasures. I loved that lovely insight. These are well-known tools of the stylistic theory that's a branch of rhetoric, a theory that was early on incorporated into Christian Latin scriptural exegesis. Early rhetorical theory was explicit about the emotional effects of such formal patterns, that is, internal rhyme, complex syntax, and other kinds of sensory effects. And this includes the kinds of rhetorical treatises that the authors of the wooing group and the talking of the love of God text would have known. And I'm going to be very grateful to Camille and Diana for their analysis of the talking of the love of God. I worked on the text and that group of texts a long, long time ago, and I'm indebted to you for putting them in front of me again. Now I'm going to try to go through the papers in sometimes in kind of chronological order and sometimes in more thematically grouped order. So we'll see. Daniel DiCenso's paper, a really working counter to a long tradition of scholarly avoidance about this issue, about the issue of, not avoidance of him, but avoidance of emotional expression in music. I have to say, I wrote this from the abstract that he wrote. And when I heard the paper, it was as it were, the paper that needed to be written before you could write the paper that was in the abstract. But the remarks that I've put together are really in relation to where I saw the paper of the abstract, that was the abstract going. But, so you'll tell me. So anyway, he is considering emotional expression in plain chant in order to come at the problem of formal theory and emotional theory versus formal effect. That is, how exactly was Augustine or anyone moved at specific moments in specific pieces of music? An issue that musicologists leave aside as too fraught. And this is where he gave this inspiring account of that. And this seems to me to underscore the difficulty of accounting for the formal material realizations of any kind of theory, but in this case it's music theory, right? Does part of the problem, I wonder about this, does part of the problem lie in the resistance of medieval musical theory to articulating in words what the impact of a form would be? I mean, indeed, let's say, bring it down to the somatic impact of a form. There are similar problems, I was thinking about this very selfishly, because there are similar problems that attend rhetorical theory and its realization in discourse. Even though rhetoric teaches in words, about words, it still just doesn't quite have the words for telling you how this is supposed to, what kind of impact this is supposed to have. What it has is people telling you how they fluttered when they read this, or their heart went palpitating, but they just can't find the words to tell you, to theorize what the impact is going to be. Marcel Elias, there you are. And I'm doing this now a little bit chronologically. I was talking about medieval romance and emotional interpolation. And this takes us, you can see I'm reading all of these very formally. This takes us to the heart of narrative devices. Here, what he calls the evaluative power of emotional depictions and displays are the emotional conditions that are invoked, not just to stir emotional responses, but they are cognitive devices that open up conceptual ambiguity. I was really interested in the way in which you're thinking about emotion as cognitive. It's a really critical field. So in the case of the argument you were making, the romances are using emotions as cognitive devices to open up ambiguities, playing ideological hostility to the Saracens against the sympathy that the text asks audiences to feel for the Saracens. So here we see not just how emotion operates at the margins of a fugitive or fleeting response, but at the core of reasoning and judgment that actually determines the formal shape that a narrative takes. And I will say that there is a long classical tradition of treating emotions as cognitive tools. I want to keep as many of the literary papers together at one time. Amy Brown's analysis of the semantic range in Middle English of the term for love, that is how the stanzaic mort calls into question the legibility of the concept of love, also helpfully calls into question what we can do with emotion words. Do emotion words mean without comparative semantic context? Do they trigger certain meanings under certain conditions that we can't recover? And I was thinking of like jokes that you had to be there for. Because it seemed to me at a certain point, this is what we're stuck with. We're really trying to reconstruct what this term could possibly have meant. Is the referent ever recoverable? Literary texts tend more to throw up barriers to legibility than to open direct routes. And I think that's really productive. So I like the way that at a certain moment you turn to sociology to say that we don't even have a perfect word now for the defining element of friendship. I thought that was a really dynamite insight, really helpful. And staying with literary papers, I also want to talk about today's talk by Lucy Kempfer, her account of what I would call the supplementarity of emotion. That is, that thing that's out there that you can't quite get. It exceeds. That which defies language. And here she's talking about it in Chaucer. And the way that Chaucer is balancing what she sees as the performative and the medical, a discourse of performativity, a discourse of medicine, she sees that as a way into the linguistic problem, or she's using it as a way into the linguistic problem of the incapacities of language to express what is most important, what we really have to say. And this led me to think about something else. Lucy, where are you? Oh, there you are. This led me to think, so I hope you won't mind that I'm kind of, but it led me to think about something else. And I think it's something related. There really are two dominant learned traditions on the emotions that are inherited from antiquity. The philosophical, which considers affect as a function of soul or mind or will, and the medical, which locates emotion in the body and looks for physical manifestations of emotion. So those two traditions would seem to be opposed, and they are typically expounded separately, yet, as in Lucy's realization about Book of the Duchess, or about Chaucer more generally, we see them continually combined, mutually informing. So, for example, in penitential manuals, you might see a philosophical or an ethical discourse on anger, which is paired with an account of how it manifests physically. So, in other words, the learned philosophical tradition is operating hand in hand with the medical tradition. So, I don't know how time is. I've lost track of time. I don't. Do I have 10 more minutes to everybody gets there? Everybody gets. Okay. So now I'm going to turn. I'm going to turn to Marlene. Your discussion today of the formal manifestations of emotional potential in the manuscripts of a notably affective text, the chastising of God's children. Okay, this is where it gets ragged. Highlighting the emotive in the manuscripts that may highlight emotive material through color or underlining, or what you talked about today were marginal annotations especially. This bears comparison with numing in poetic manuscripts. That is, marking a poetic text for its voiced potential. So Marjorie Curry Wood, somebody who works wonderfully in history of rhetoric and other things, she's been working on classroom manuscripts of Virgil and Lucan, considering what kinds of passages are singled out for numing or other marginalia, indicating when a character's speech is perceived as particularly worthy of reciting aloud or memorizing. And in almost all the cases, the speech represents an emotional highlight of the poem, something like Dido's angry or pathetic speeches in Aeneid 4. So I also just wondered to what extent we can actually see a kind of horizontal, similarity there. In the manuscripts of chastising, they may also suggest the private performative responses that the compiler sees the text dictating. So, and I also like the way that you showed us a kind of chain of emotional directives through a series of annotators in one manuscript. So, now, okay, Sarah Brazil on shoes. This is there you are. This is irresistible. Even as we enjoy the homely, or in American English, homey, reminder that even a journey to God needs shoes and feet, we also appreciate that Sarah is outlining a discourse of theology and theological history in which the phenomenology of the shoe, and this to me is so funny, it's so interesting, the shoe leads away from the phenomenon to the mystery of ascent. In other words, in a direction opposite to what Heidegger describes in his Origin of the Work of Art, where Van Gogh's painting of shoes leads to an apprehension of the experientiality of shoes. In these texts, you're not really seeing shoes. You are seeing. So Sarah is reminding us that shoes are metaphors, shoes of heavenly desires, and that it is not the object but the discourse of the object that provides the record of emotions from which the historian can draw. I want to take yesterday's roundtable together in one group. 3 papers were about language, and the 4th paper was about performance. They all happily, fruitfully upset comfortable assumptions that we may bring to linguistic analysis. Sarah Baccianti's account of how linguistic formulas mediate emotion takes us directly, that is in Old Norse and Old English, takes us directly into the problems of comparative literary research. What do we do with literary traditions that don't share our language of emotional knowledge and that don't even share a common language with other medieval literary traditions? And it's just a coincidence. I spent a week in May in Iceland speaking to students about my work, Latin, the history of rhetoric and the emotions. And one of the questions that came up justifiably, it felt like every hour, was what has Latin rhetorical theory to do with, saga literature? And they were absolutely right. And I kept saying, well, there's all this Latin stuff in Scandinavia, and, and it was an utterly legitimate question. And in fact, they must have been reading your work because I asked them to talk about how emotions are represented in saga literature, and they talked about things like manifestations of anger, the visual, bodily manifestations of anger. So really, what you are doing is putting your finger on the greatest problems for comparative research. The language of emotion in Old Norse and Old English is very close to the language of touch and sensation, from which medieval Latin, through its classical philosophical origins, is really quite distant. Latin is just not that tactile a language in the way that these vernaculars are. So anyway, it was quite a humbling week for me in Reykjavik. Okay, now here. Anita Auer's explanation, I know Anita's not here, but her explanation of the corpus linguistic approach performed for us a great service by explaining carefully how a quantitative and then qualitative analysis can work. It also brings to the foreground the ways in which disciplines adjacent to each other use language as evidence. So for the literary scholar, language is a slippery, labile medium, always distortive, and yet it's all that we have. We thrash about in language, and we never quite believe the truth claims of literary language, yet we're never quite sure of any truth that lies beyond it. This, I think, is in part at least what René V is enacting by showing us how an Anglo-Norman devotional poem desires to say more about the name of Jesus, shifting its devotional focus from Jesus to the name Jesus, to the mouth that utters and holds the name Jesus. The poem works with the knowledge that Jesus can never be named satisfactorily in human terms. Words can never even capture, in the same way that words can never really capture the somatic experience of taste. But for corpus linguistic analysis, words constitute a different kind of evidence. They are the artifacts, the objects, whose occurrence and frequency is the enabling ground for interpretive analysis, even the analysis of the insufficiency of words. And it is also the insufficiency of words. I bet Tamara is wondering how I'm going to get this in to insufficiency of words. Where is Tamara? Oh, there you are. But in a way, it is the insufficiency of words on the page that Tamara asks us to think about by deploying instead site-specific performance as a framework of analysis for the mystery plays. And here, I think, at least for me, this was my sense of it, we really reach the limits of the written record of representation as legible access to anything beyond itself. I mean, in other words, you taught me, what can I really know about what is going on there? Literary studies here, I mean, in terms of at least medieval literary studies, deploying the device, or the theoretical principle of site-specific performance, seems to be courting or flirting with a certain model of social history, that notion of let's recover the communal script. But, if I understand correctly, the medieval application of the notion of site-specific performance draws back from that notion of getting at the real thing, that notion of social history evidence, by proffering instead not synthetic narrative about what must have happened, but a set of hypotheses that build on the principles of performance analysis in contemporary context. And I think we saw that realized beautifully today in the performance, which you two were responsible for. Where the actors are some of our actors. Oh my goodness! Well, it was just fabulous, and it realized for me everything that site-specific performance ought to be, or site-specific performance theory can tell me. It was just a fabulous, and you worked very, very hard. So thank you very much. And let's see, I need to, so this is the point at which it gets a little bit ragged. I'm sorry about this. Okay, I'm done with this. That's good. Okay, I have a few more people to get through, and then we're done. Charlotte Steenbroek's guided reading through the Abraham and Isaac plays poses for us an important question. When is emotional response almost counterproductive for theological teaching? I thought a lot about what I had in abstract, but how does a pious intention to teach the biblical narrative become a pretext for the emotional pleasure that Aristotle recognized that we experience through a tragedy, when we build up and release pity and fear, Elios and Phobos? For Aristotle, the group experience of catharsis, part somatic, part ethical, was a sufficient explanation for the power of tragedy, sufficient justification for the form and the art form. But the medieval stage operates under a different didactic regime, one in which the value of the art form is justified when it leads to something beyond itself, a supervening moral and spiritual truth. Charlotte, where is Charlotte? There you are. Puts her finger on that moment where we see the governing discourse, that is Christian didacticism, yielding to another pressure for which they don't quite have a language, the pleasure of mimesis. It's here, I wonder if it is here that the very absence of a discursive framework can help us see a discourse coming into being that is aesthetics. I just wonder. And now, I think I am, oh my goodness, let's see. All right, you have to give me a second to, that is right, okay. And now, I think I am almost at the end. If I have got everybody except the art historians, I wanted to talk about you together. I want to talk about the two. Have I missed anybody? Because it involves missing a page. Have I missed anybody else? Raise your hand if I have. Okay. Then I'm going to end with the art historians. I would like to talk about you two together. I give you separate responses. Catherine Ivar's presentation on ivory gives us the most vivid example of what I've described in my opening remarks as of the object or artifact or representation constituting the object of our inquiry, as opposed to that which it might lie beyond it. The ivories, whatever their narrative contents, bring us into a domain of somatic intimacy, not just with the destined owner, but with the warm sensuality of ivory itself. Ivory, which you said is likened to soft skin, tactile in a way that's unique, forces us to look at its materiality and not through it. And Catherine said that the material of ivory is meaningful because it's animal. But its animal meaningfulness speaks more loudly, I think, than parchment. You can tell me if I'm wrong. It's not just medium, it's also the very object that we behold. And I think that this throws the representation sweepstakes into productive disarray. It disturbs every perceptual and mimetic orthodoxy. And Michaela's wonderful presentation on the cyan cope also, I think, just throws the representations orthodoxies into wonderful disarray. Where does emotion sit? Does it sit in and around an object? I think this object opens up more productive questions than I think any of us can really answer. So we know it's decorated with stories, it's made of luxury materials, but it also involves a certain kind of clerical fashion sense because the Pope wanted one. But how do we approach it? You talked about stitching emotion. Does the object tell us something about affective responses? We can think about the extraordinary craftsmanship, that extraordinary stitching method, which produces a certain kind of tactile quality. One thing that occurred to me is that, again, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but here they are actually creating a new material in a way that ivory is not creating. You work with ivory, it's an extraordinary, you do things to it, and you make it into something else. But here you're actually building a new material. It's quite an extraordinary thing. So it's forcing you to look at it. It's, again, really putting form on the front burners. And so I also wonder, of course, isn't any luxury item a repository of desire, of appetite? We did talk about seeing emotion in terms of the stories that are on the cope, that are also narrating emotion. But those stories, that content becomes utterly indistinguishable from the physical form as well as the materiality of the object. And of course, it asks us then to think about the role of the body as the site of emotion because of the way that the cope sits on the body, how the narratives spring into life when it is placed around a body. Anyway, that was just, it was such an extraordinary way of somehow wrapping up that's more pun than I intended, but somehow wrapping up our encounters with form and with representation. So to sum up, arts and literature insist on form as the object of our inquiry, on representation and constructiveness as necessary mediations, on language itself as more than the transparent relayer of evidence, and they insist also on the very materiality of the media, sonic, visual or tactile, and verbal, through which mimetic form makes its determinative impact on us. Thank you very much. Want to handle this? This is the wrap-up moment.
I think the only thing we can say to that is wow. And thank you so much for this wonderful response, which dealt with presentations and your personal work. So it's been wonderful to hear you and to have your feedback. And I don't think a plenary necessarily requires question. I think you have offered a lot of feedback to all of us. If Mary is in agreement with that we could sort of end with comments linked to the workshop in general.
That's what I. That's
but
what
we can also stop.
Stop. It's time for a drink. As you wish, as you feel.
You know what? Actually, I'm just going to intervene because
yes,
I have to say that the word "stop" makes me really want to say that this is a show-stopping response. So I really think that this is one that really you deserve a drink. We all do. I think after that, but really that was a showstopper, and I'm so grateful to you for the way that you both.
I'm so grateful to all of you.
That you picked up on certainly what I was trying to achieve or hoping to achieve at this workshop, but you have also clarified it for me. And especially in the way that you are kind of noting, perhaps that you're trying to move away from approaches to emotion that try to conform to what you describe as the extra-textual reality fixation of historians, and instead move towards approaches that take the forms that engage with emotions as their object. Thank you. Thank you for helping me realize that's what we're doing today. So really, thank you for that. And on that note, I think I'd really like to bring this workshop to a close. And please join me in thanking Rita for bringing this to